future CAs. So let us start with understanding the meaning of the internal audit. Okay. So it's a function of an entity that performs assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, risk management, and internal control processes. मैंने बोला it's an assurance and consulting activities. So it's a function of an entity. So it's a department in an entity that performs assurance and consulting activities which is designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, risk management, and internal control processes. So मैंने बोला it's the function of an entity that performs assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, risk management, and internal control processes. तो मैंने बोला components of internal control क्या होता है? मैंने बोला control environment होता है, that is what is the governance mechanism at the entity. ठीक है? Then entities risk assessment, then information system and communication, then control activities, and then monitoring of internal control. ठीक है? तो monitoring of internal control का part होता है internal audit department. So it's a function of an entity, ठीक है, that performs assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the entity's governance, that is control environment, and risk management, that is entity's risk assessment, and internal control processes that covers information system and communication and control activities. So मैंने बोला it's the function of an entity, it's the function, internal audit is the function of an entity designed that provides assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the entity effectiveness of the entity's governance, risk management, and internal control processes. तो अब जो हमने पढ़ा, that is objective and scope of the internal audit function is to enhance the entity's governance process, risk management, and internal control processes. Right? हमने ये तीन चीजें पढ़ी. Entity की governance को अच्छा करता है, risk management को अच्छा करता है, and internal controls को अच्छा करता है. Right? So the objective and scope, अगर मैं बोलूँ, the objective and scope of the internal audit function typically includes assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance process, risk management process, and internal control processes, such as the following. That is activities relating to governance, activities relating to risk management, and activities relating to internal control. ठीक है? अभी internal control में ये चार चीजें और करते हैं. That is evaluation of internal control, evaluation of financial and operating information, review of operating activities, and review of compliance with laws and regulation. तो मैंने बोला what is the objective and scope of internal audit? मैंने बोला it's fairly simple. So they assess the entities activities with reference to activities relating to entities governance, है ना, and activities relating to risk management, and activities relating to internal control. Then they evaluate the internal control, they examine the financial and operating information, they review the operating activities, and they review the compliance with laws and regulation. Okay, so objective and scope of the internal audit function is to basically what we have learned as objective and scope of the internal audit function. It provides assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, risk management, and internal control. मैंने बोला, so the objective and scope of the internal audit function is to evaluate the entity's governance process, risk management process, and internal control processes. So entity's governance process में you will assess governance process with respect to ethics and values. क्या governance जो management है that is promoting ethics and values, and how the performance is managed. So how does the promotion is taking place? प्रमोशन ऐसा तो नहीं है जो बंदा डिजर्व नहीं करता उसका हो रहा है. ठीक है? सो हाउ डज द परफॉर्मेंस मैनेजमेंट एंड अकाउंटेबिलिटी इज टेकिंग प्लेस, and how does the management communicate risk and control information to appropriate areas of the organization? So how does the management communicate? How does the TCWG communicate risk and control information to the appropriate areas of the organization? And what is the effectiveness of communication between TCWG, external and internal auditors, and the management? मैंने बोला, so activities relating to governance would include its accomplishment of the objectives on ethics and values. What is the performance management and accountability? How does the management is communicating risk and control information to appropriate areas? And what is the effectiveness of communication among TCWG, external and internal auditors, and the management? So the internal audit function may assess the governance process in accomplishment of the objectives on ethics and values, performance management, then communication of risk and control information to appropriate areas, and effectiveness of communications amongst TCWG, management, external auditor, and internal auditors. Then risk management. Okay, so identifying and evaluating significant exposures to risk and contributing to the improvement of the risk management and internal control. Okay, and assist the entity in detection of fraud. तो मैंने बोला basically identify करना risk को and then contributing to the improvement of the risk management and the internal control. So मैंने बोला activities relating to risk management includes the internal audit function may assist the entity in identifying and evaluating significant exposures to risk and contributing to the improvement of the risk management and internal control. It may also help in the detection of the fraud. अभी evaluation of internal control में क्या करेगा? They will review the controls, they will evaluate their operation and recommend improvements. So review the controls, evaluate their operation. क्या वो actual में operate कर रहे हैं? ठीक है? तो I have to review the controls, evaluate their operation and recommend improvement. Examination of financial and operating information में क्या करेगा? Internal auditor. He will review the means used to identify, recognize, measure, classify, and report financial and operating information. So how does the financial and operating information is getting prepared? So review the means used to identify, recognize, measure, classify, and report financial and operating information, and to make some specific inquiry into individual items, including detailed testing of transaction balances and procedures. So he will identify, he will review the means that is used to report financial and operating information, and he will make some specific inquiry into individual items. Then reviewing the operating activities means economy, efficiency, and effectiveness of the operating effectives. And then review of the compliance with laws and regulation will involve reviewing the compliance with laws, regulation, and other external requirements. So it also includes compliance with laws and regulation and also internal policies. So that is the management policies and directive and other internal requirement. तो मैंने बोला एक बार फटाफट ना internal audit की definition को revise कर लेते हैं. So it's the function of an entity that performs assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, risk management, and internal control processes. Then we learned about the assessment with respect to activities of the activities relating to governance, right? So internal audit function may assess the governance process in accomplishment of its objective, four objective, that is first is ethics and values, then performance management and accountability, then communicating risk and control information to appropriate areas of the organization, and effectiveness of communications amongst TCWG management, internal and external auditor. Then risk management, that is identifying and evaluating significant exposures to risk and contributing to the risk management and internal control. And it also involves detection of fraud. Okay, evaluation of control, then reviewing controls, evaluating their effectiveness, and recommending, evaluating their operation and recommending improvements. And it provides assurance on the control. So basically an examination of the financial and operating information means how does the internal auditor will review the means used to identify and report the financial and operating information, and will also make some specific inquiry into the individual items, and then review the operating activities, that is economy, efficiency, and effectiveness of the operating activities, and then will review the compliance with laws, regulations, and other external requirements along with the management policies and directives and other internal requirements. तो ये हमने पूरा समझ लिया है, ठीक है. Ways in which the external auditor may make use of the function for the purposes of the audit. मैंने बोला internal audit function can help the external auditor in three ways. One is providing the relevant information for the purpose of risk assessment. So obtaining information for the purpose of risk assessment, or we can use the work of the internal audit that has been performed by their team as an audit evidence, या फिर I can use the internal auditor to perform audit procedures under the direction, supervision, and review of the external auditor. So मैंने बोला there are three cases that I can obtain the relevant information for the. So what are the ways? So external auditor may make use of the function for the purpose of audit in one or more of the following ways. So he can obtain the information relevant to the external auditor's assessment of the wrong. He can use the function or use the internal audit work use the work of the internal audit for audit evidences. And he can also use internal auditor to perform audit procedures under the direction, supervision, and review of the internal auditor. अभी जो SE 610 का scope है, it covers only two situations, that is this and this. It does not cover this situation. Okay, so this is the only scope of SE 610, that is when using the work of internal audit function in obtaining audit evidence and using internal auditor to provide direct assistance under the direction, supervision, and review of the external auditor. तो ये हमने ऑलरेडी समझ लिया है. अब ये मैंडेटरी नहीं है कि आपको इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन का काम यूज करना चाहिए. सो यूज ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन इज द सोल डिस्क्रिप्शन ऑफ द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर. मैंने बोला एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर की ही रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी है ऑन द ओवरऑल ओपिनियन, एंड दैट रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी इज नॉट reduced by the usage of the internal audit function. So external auditor has sole responsibility for the audit opinion expressed, and it is not reduced by the external auditors use of the work of internal audit function or the internal auditors to provide direct assistance. मैंने बोला दो situations हो सकती है. I can use the work that has been done by the internal auditor as an audit evidence. मतलब जो काम already internal auditor ने कर रखा है, I can use that work as an audit evidence, या फिर I can involve the internal audit function under my direction, supervision and review to perform the work. ठीक है. So external auditor has sole responsibility for the audit opinion expressed, and responsibility is not reduced by the external auditors use of the work of the internal audit function or the internal auditors to provide direct assistance. 1 second, let me put in the charger. Now you think why such a requirement is placed कि external auditor has the sole responsibility for his audit opinion, because हम क्या कह रहे हैं, internal auditor is generally employed by the entity and therefore not fully independent. So internal auditor is generally not fully independent as generally employed by the organization. ठीक है. And SH 610 defines conditions necessary for the external auditor to use the work of internal auditors. Like he has to evaluate whether the internal audit function is sufficiently objectivity means independent है. ठीक है. Competence उनके पास. ठीक है. Why such conditions? So that you don't use undue use of the work. Okay, so external auditor has the sole responsibility for the audit opinion expressed, and that responsibility is not reduced by the external auditor's use of the work of the internal audit function or the internal auditors to provide the direct assistance. For a reason, internal audit is not sufficiently independent of the entity, and SA 610 defines conditions necessary for the auditor to use the work of internal audit function. These conditions are necessary so that auditor does not overuse the work of internal audit. And SA 610 defines necessary work of effort to be carried out to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidences on the work of the internal audit function or the internal auditor is providing direct assistance. So he has to evaluate whether the work of internal audit function or internal auditors providing direct assistance is adequate for the purposes of the audit. तो मुझे इसके ऊपर sufficient and appropriate audit evidence लेना है that the work of the internal audit function or the internal auditor providing direct assistance is adequate for the purposes of my audit. ठीक है. तो मैंने बोला external auditor has sole responsibility for the audit opinion express, and the responsibility is not reduced by the external auditor's use of the work of internal audit function or the internal auditors to provide direct assistance. Although they may perform audit procedures similar to those performed by external auditor, neither the internal audit function nor the internal auditors are independent of the entity. Therefore, SA defines certain conditions that are necessary for the external auditor, and these conditions are necessary so that you don't over or undue use of such work. ठीक है. What is the objectives of the external auditor? Very very important. ठीक है. Objectives as per SA 610, क्योंकि यही पूरे स्टैंडर्ड को डिफाइन करेगा, यही पूरे स्टैंडर्ड को डिफाइन करेगा. So objectives of the external auditor when an entity has an internal audit function. So the objectives of the external auditor where the entity has an internal audit function and the external auditor expects to use the work of the function. So external auditors expects to use the work of the function. So external auditor is expecting to use the work of the function to modify the nature, timing, or reduce the extent of the audit procedure to be performed directly by the external auditor. So I am planning to use the work of internal auditor for the purpose of reducing the nature, timing, or extent of certain procedures that are to be performed directly by the external auditor, or to use internal auditors to provide direct assistance. So I can think about two situations. One is that I am planning to use the work of internal audit function. Internal audit function means that the work has been already performed by the internal audit function and I'm planning to use it. So the objective of the external auditor when the entity has internal audit function and the external auditor expects to use the work of the function to modify the nature, timing, and extent of the audit procedures to be performed directly by the external auditor. So मैंने बोला अब मैं थोड़ा सा काम कम करके I will use the audit evidences that has been already obtained by the internal auditor, या फिर to use internal auditor to provide direct assistance. So I have to consider है ना to provide direct assistance. So the objectives are the following: to determine whether the work of the internal function or direct assistance, दो वर्ड है यहाँ पे पूरे स्टैंडर्ड में, to determine whether the work of internal audit function or direct assistance from internal auditors can be used and if so, in which areas and to what extent. तो क्या मैं work use कर सकता हूँ? It will depend on objectivity, competence and systematic and disciplined approach followed by the internal audit department. ये भी हम नीचे पढ़ेंगे. Whether the work can be used of the internal audit function, whether the direct assistance can be used of the internal auditors, very important, whether the work can be used of the internal auditors, internal audit function, and whether we can engage internal auditors under our direction and supervision and review, whether we can use internal auditors to perform work under our direction and supervision and review, in which areas we can use it, in which areas we can use it, and to what extent we can use it. So determine whether work can be used in which areas and to what extent. If using the work of internal audit function, that is the first situation when I'm using the work of internal audit function as an evidence. Okay, to determine whether that work is adequate for the purposes of the audit, then I have to also determine whether that work is adequate for the purposes of the audit, and if using internal auditor to provide direct assistance, to appropriately direct, supervise, and review their work. So then my responsibility is to direct, supervise, and review their work. So the objective of the external auditor, when an entity has an internal audit function and the external auditor expects to use the work of internal audit function to modify the nature, timing, and extent of the audit procedures that were to be performed directly by the external auditor, या फिर external auditors expects to use internal auditor to provide direct assistance, then he will have to consider to determine whether the work of the internal audit function can be used, या फिर internal auditors can be engaged, can be used, internal audit function or direct assistance from internal auditors can be used, and if so, in which areas and to what extent. And having made that determination, then you have to consider that the use of the work of the internal audit function is adequate for the purpose of the audit, and if using the work of internal auditors to provide direct assistance, to appropriately direct, supervise, and review their work. So I have to review there. So when using the work of internal audit function, I have to ensure that the work is adequate for the purposes of the audit. ठीक है? And then evaluating the internal audit function. मतलब अभी हम जो बात कर रहे हैं, that is evaluating the internal audit function, not about direct assistance. It's about when I am using the internal audit function, when for I am using the internal audit function work as in direct audit evidences to reduce my nature, timing, and extent of audit procedures. So this is the first situation. ठीक है? तो मैंने बोला, so the first objective of the external auditor to determine whether the work of the internal auditor can be used. तो अब हमने बोला, ठीक है, इसमें हमें क्या देखना पड़ेगा, क्या what is the extent to which the internal audit functions, organizational status, and relevant policies and procedures support the objectivity. So what is the so अभी हम बात कर रहे हैं internal audit function की. मैंने बोला what is the extent to which the internal audit functions, organizational status, and relevant policies and procedures support the objectivity of the internal auditor. What is the level of competence of the internal audit function, and whether the internal audit function applies a systematic and disciplined approach including quality control. तो जब आप डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस में जाओगे ना, तो ये नीचे वाला पॉइंट हट जाएगा, क्योंकि यहाँ पे इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन का डायरेक्शन, सुपरविजन एंड रिव्यू आप खुद ही कर रहे हो. सो योर कंट्रोल, क्वालिटी कंट्रोल वुड अप्लाई. ठीक है? तो जब आप बस डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस, मतलब आप देखो, अभी यू आर डिटरमाइनिंग वेदर द वर्क कैन बी यूज्ड, so you are evaluating whether the organization, that is internal audit function, is sufficiently objective, whether it is sufficiently competent. So objectivity, competence, and then application of systematic and disciplined approach including quality control. ये वाला पॉइंट हट जाएगा जब आप डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस के लिए डिटरमाइन कर रहे हो whether you can use the work of internal auditor or not. So this point will get eliminated. ठीक है? तो जब हम नीचे डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस पढ़ेंगे तो वहां पे सिर्फ ऑब्जेक्टिविटी एंड कॉम्पिटेंस के बारे में पॉइंट होगा. मैंने बोला the extent to which the internal audit functions, organizational status, and relevant policies and procedures support the objectivity of the internal auditor. तो मैंने बोला I am determining whether the work can be used of internal audit function. One is internal audit function, then is direct assistance. तो मैंने बोला internal audit function में I need competence, objectivity, and systematic and disciplined approach, since the work is being carried out under the direction, supervision, review of the internal audit function. So systematic and disciplined approach, including quality control, is required for this thing. Okay? So the extent to which the internal audit functions, organizational status, and relevant policies and procedures support the objectivity of the internal auditors. So what is the extent to which the internal audit functions, organizational status, and relevant policies and procedures support the objectivity. What is the level of the competence of the internal audit function, and whether the internal audit function applies a systematic and disciplined approach, including quality control. ठीक है, तो अभी हम पढ़ेंगे objectivity, then competence, then application of a systematic and disciplined approach through this chart. Objectivity means that it refers to the ability to perform those tasks. I can perform the task without allowing bias, conflict of interest, or undue influence of others to override my professional judgment. So it means the ability to perform task without allowing bias, conflict of interest, or undue influence of others to override professional judgment. So when I बोला ability to perform task without allowing personal bias, conflict of interest, or undue influence of others to override professional judgment. So what are the factors that may affect the auditor's evaluation in relation to objectivity? तो मैंने बोला whether the organizational status of the internal audit function, that is the function's authority and accountability. मैंने बोला function के पास क्या authority है and किसको वो accountable है. अगर वो accountable TCWG को है, accountable वो TCWG को है, तो that means they are sufficiently independent. ठीक है, तो what is the organizational status of the internal audit function, that is the function's authority and accountability to be free from bias, conflict of interest, or undue influence of others to override professional judgment. तो इसमें हमने एग्जांपल पढ़ा था, अगर आपको याद हो, इसमें हमने एग्जांपल पढ़ा था, अगर मान लो इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन की जो रिपोर्टिंग है TCWG के पास है डायरेक्टली, या फिर और एन ऑफिसर विद अप्रोप्रिएट अथॉरिटी, द फंक्शन रिपोर्ट्स, और इफ द फंक्शन रिपोर्ट्स टू मैनेजमेंट बट कैन डायरेक्टली एक्सेस द TCWG, whether it has direct access to TCWG will impact the determination of whether the TCWG में आपको मैंने समझाया था ना, सारे इंडिपेंडेंट डायरेक्टर्स होते हैं, दे आर नॉट रिलेटेड टू द एंटिटी, एंड इफ द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन हैज अप्रोचेबिलिटी या फिर अकाउंटेबिलिटी टू देम, दैट इज कंसिडर्ड दैट इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन इज मोर रिलायबल. ठीक है, एंड हु डिसाइड्स द रेम्यूनरेशन. ठीक है, एम्प्लॉयमेंट डिसीजन इज टेकन केयर बाय TCWG. इफ दैट इज द केस, then it is considered to be more objective. ठीक है, internal audit function is considered to be more objective. And are there any constraints or restrictions placed on the internal audit department to directly communicate with the external auditor? So are there any constraints or restriction on the internal audit function that has been placed by management or TCWG, for example, in communicating the internal audit function findings to the external auditor? So are there any restriction or constraints placed? ठीक है, एंड इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन इज फ्री ऑफ एनी कॉन्फ्लिक्टिंग रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज. इसका मतलब क्या है कि ऐसा नहीं हो रहा है कि इंटरनल ऑडिट जिस कंट्रोल को इवैल्यूएट कर रहा है वो कंट्रोल खुद ही चला रहा है. मान लो मैंने एक बैंक ट्रेजरी हेड ही इंटरनल कंट्रोल का हेड है, मान लो, तो ट्रेजरी हेड ने बैंक रिकंसिलिएशन का कंट्रोल परफॉर्म किया, अब आप उसी को बोल रहे हो आप उसका इंटरनल ऑडिट कर दे, तो भाई वो सही नहीं है. सो इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन इज फ्री ऑफ एनी कॉन्फ्लिक्टिंग रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज, for example having managerial or operational duties or responsibility that are outside of the internal audit function. तो हमने objectivity को पूरा समझ लिया. मैंने बोला it refers to the ability to perform the task without conflict of interest or undue influence or biasness of others to override the professional judgment. अभी बात कर रहे हैं competence की. ठीक है, it refers to the attainment and maintenance. Very important, attain करनी है आपको डिग्री और उसको maintain करना है. जैसे CA की डिग्री attain करी, लेकिन उसको आपको maintain भी करना है through updation of your skill set. ठीक है, it refers to attainment and maintenance of knowledge and skills at the level required to enable assigned tasks to be performed diligently and in accordance with the professional standard. तो मैंने बोला attainment and maintenance of knowledge and skills at the level required to enable the assigned task to be performed diligently and in accordance with applicable performance standard. So what are the factors that may affect the external auditor's determination in relation to competence include the following. ठीक है, so whether the internal audit function is adequately and appropriately resourced. क्या appropriate बंदे हैं, मतलब सही टाइप, मतलब adequately and appropriately, मतलब जितने चाहिए उतने बंदे हैं. दूसरा appropriately resourced, so adequately and appropriately resourced relative to the size of the entity and the nature of its operation. तो मैंने बोला whether the internal audit department is adequately and appropriately resourced considering the size of the entity and the nature of its operation, and whether there are established policies for hiring, training, and assigning internal auditors to the internal audit engagement. So what are the policies for hiring, training, and assigning internal auditors to internal audit engagements? And internal auditors have adequate technical training and proficiency, and internal auditors possess the required knowledge relating to the entity's financial reporting and the applicable FRF. मैंने बोला उनको फिनेंशियल रिपोर्टिंग की नॉलेज है, एप्लीकेबल एफआरएफ की नॉलेज है जिसमें एंटिटी रिपोर्ट करती है. इंटरनल ऑडिटर्स हैव द नॉलेज रिलेटिंग टू द एंटिटीज फाइनेंशियल रिपोर्टिंग, and the applicable FRF. ठीक है, they have adequate technical training and proficiency training. They have established policies for hiring, training, and assigning internal auditors to the internal audit engagement. They are adequately staffed and appropriately resourced. ठीक है, and then application of a systematic and disciplined approach. This is particularly important in only in case of using the when you are using the work of an internal audit function as an audit evidences. When you are using the work of an internal auditors, ठीक है, वहां पे आप internal auditors word use करोगे because you are not using the work of any function, but rather you are engaging them to perform the work under your direction, supervision, and review. And therefore, this point will not be applicable when you will be discussing direct assistance. ठीक है, so approach to planning, performing, supervising, reviewing, and documenting distinguishes the activities of the internal audit function from other monitoring of the activities. तो मैंने बोला monitoring of controls का एक part है, that is internal audit function that assess that provides assurance and consulting services with that provides assurance and consulting services to evaluate the entity's governance process, risk management process, and the internal control processes, right? So this is the definition what we have learned. So the approach to planning, so they would have planned, performed, supervised, reviewed, and documented. So this differentiates the internal audit department. जब हमने monitoring of controls पढ़ा था, तो हमने दो चीजें पढ़ी थी. Monitoring of controls can be done either as part of the ongoing activities or through separate evaluations. So separate evaluations is generally done by the internal audit department. So what differentiates internal audit department is the planning, performance, supervision, review, and documentation, right? So what are the factors that are relevant? So existence, adequacy, and use of the internal documented internal audit procedures or guidance. मतलब internal audit department की procedure या guidance की manual है. So existence, adequacy, and use for the purpose of risk assessment, work programs, documentation and reporting, nature and extent of which is commensurate with the size and circumstances of the entity. तो मैंने बोला existence of the documented internal audit procedures or guidances for the purpose of risk assessment, work programs, documentation and reporting, which is commensurate with the size and circumstances of the entity. And internal audit function has appropriate quality control policies and procedures. तो उनके पास quality control लगा रखा है उन्होंने this internal audit department ने. तो हमने पढ़ लिया using the work of internal audit function. तो आपको when determining whether to use, तो आपको तीन चीजें देखनी है, क्या वो objective है, क्या वो competent है, and क्या whether it applies a systematic and disciplined approach. जब हमने objectivity की बात करी, तो हमने बात करी what is the functions, authority, and accountability. Then who decides the employment decisions? Are there any constraints or restrictions? And are there any conflicting responsibilities? When we learned about the competence, whether the department is adequately and appropriately resourced, whether there are policies for hiring, training, and assigning internal auditors to internal audit engagement, and internal auditors have adequate technical training and proficiency in auditing, and internal auditors possess the required knowledge relating to the entity's financial reporting and applicable FRF. And then whether the policies with respect to risk assessments, work program have been documented, right? Circumstances when the work of the internal auditor cannot be used. तो मैंने बोला अगर competence नहीं है, objectivity नहीं है, या फिर this function does not apply a systematic and disciplined approach, तो आप इनका काम नहीं use कर सकते. अब determining the nature. So मैंने बोला अब दो चीजें हमने पढ़ी थी. एक तो हमने पढ़ा था वेदर वी कैन यूज, तो उसको हमने आंसर कर दिया, दैट इज कॉम्पिटेंस होनी चाहिए, ऑब्जेक्टिविटी होती चाहिए, सिस्टमैटिक एंड डिसिप्लिन अप्रोच. इन व्हाट एरियाज एंड टू व्हाट एक्सटेंट. अभी हम बात करते हैं टू व्हाट एक्सटेंट, ठीक है. तो मैंने बोला मैं उतना ही काम यूज कर सकता हूँ जितना इंटरनल ऑडिटर परफॉर्म करने का प्लान कर रहा है. सो व्हाट इज द नेचर एंड स्कोप ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन वर्क has been performed or planned to be performed by the IA function that is relevant to the external auditor's overall audit strategy and audit plan. So what is the nature and scope of the work? So I am using the work of internal audit function as an audit evidence, right? So I have to evaluate, so as a basis for determining the areas and the extent to which the work of the internal audit function can be used. यहाँ पे मैंने आपको बोला दो सिचुएशन थी, एक डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस एंड इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन. अभी हम इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन के बारे में बात कर रहे हैं. द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर शैल कंसीडर द नेचर एंड स्कोप ऑफ द वर्क दैट हैज बीन परफॉर्म्ड or is planned to be performed by the internal audit function, and it's relevant to the external auditor's overall audit strategy and audit plan. So in other words, once the external auditor has determined that the work of the internal audit function can be used for the purposes of audit, a first consideration is the planned nature and scope of the work of internal audit function. So what is the scope and objective of the internal audit function that has been performed or is planned to be performed, and whether it is relevant to the overall audit strategy and overall audit plan. So what is the nature and scope of the internal audit function that has been performed or planned to be performed by the IA function, and its relevance to the external auditor's overall audit strategy and plan. So मैंने बोला whether we can use depends on objectivity, competence, and systematic and disciplined approach, and in what areas we can use, we will discuss it now, and to what extent depends on what is the scope, nature and scope of the internal auditor's work. Okay, in what areas we can use, examples of work of the internal audit function that can be used by the external auditor include the following: in testing the operating effectiveness of control, in substantive procedures involving limited judgments, in observation of inventory count, in tracing transaction through the information system relevant to the financial reporting. मैंने बोला इन्वेंट्री काउंट में यूज कर सकता हूँ, सब्सटैंटिव प्रोसीजर्स में यूज कर सकता हूँ, दैट हैज सम लिमिटेड जजमेंट्स, एंड टेस्टिंग द ऑपरेटिंग इफेक्टिवनेस ऑफ कंट्रोल. लेकिन ये सब डिपेंड, एंड टू व्हाट एक्सटेंट डिपेंड्स what is the scope of the internal auditor work, ठीक है, and what is the relevance of that scope to the overall audit strategy and the audit plan. Then tracing transaction through information system relevant to financial reporting and testing of compliance with regulatory requirement. ये तो हमने स्कोप में भी पढ़ा था, राइट. तो मैंने बोला टेस्टिंग ऑफ ऑपरेटिंग इफेक्टिवनेस ऑफ कंट्रोल, ये भी हमारा स्कोप से पॉइंट आ रहा है. ये दोनों पॉइंट नए हैं, ठीक है. ट्रेसिंग ट्रांजैक्शन थ्रू इंफॉर्मेशन सिस्टम रेलेवेंट टू फाइनेंशियल रिपोर्टिंग, इन एरियाज में मैं सोच सकता हूँ टू यूज द वर्क ऑफ इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन. मैंने बोला operating when testing the operating effectiveness of control, substantive procedures involving limited judgment, observation of inventory count, tracing transaction from the information system relevant to financial reporting, and testing of compliance with regulatory requirement. ठीक है. अब मैंने बोला in what areas, ठीक है, in what areas and to what extent, and whether we can use. Whether we can use depends on objectivity, competence, and systematic and disciplined approach. In what areas, किस areas में मैं use कर सकता हूँ. मैंने बोला operating effectiveness of control, substantive procedures having limited judgment. फिर मैंने बोला inventory counts में use कर सकता हूँ, tracing transaction through information system relevant to the financial reporting, and testing of compliance with regulatory requirement. Please note that I can also use them in testing of compliance with regulatory requirement, क्योंकि वो उनके scope में भी होता है. Review of compliance with laws and regulation, इसलिए पेपर में शायद आ सकता है और आप कंफ्यूज ना हो जाओ, ठीक है. ये शायद compliance with regulatory reporting में क्या हम यूज कर सकते हैं या नहीं कर सकते. And to what extent depends on what is the nature and scope of the internal auditor's work and its relevance to the overall audit strategy and audit plan. Circumstances जहाँ पे हमें कम से कम वर्क यूज करना चाहिए इंटरनल ऑडिटर का और ज्यादा से ज्यादा परफॉर्म करना चाहिए खुद. तो मैंने बोला सर्कमस्टांसेस इन विच लेस, मतलब यहाँ पे ये नहीं बोला कि नो वर्क टू बी यूज. नो वर्क हम कब यूज करेंगे, जब कोई भी ऑब्जेक्टिविटी नहीं है, कोई भी कॉम्पिटेंस नहीं है, या फिर सिस्टमैटिक एंड डिसिप्लिन अप्रोच नहीं है, ठीक है. यहाँ पे वी आर यूजिंग द लेस ऑफ द वर्क ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन एंड परफॉर्म मोर ऑफ द वर्क डायरेक्टली. तो मैंने बोला जहाँ पे ज्यादा जजमेंट इन्वॉल्व है इन प्लानिंग एंड परफॉर्मिंग रेलेवेंट ऑडिट प्रोसीजर्स एंड इन इवैल्यूएटिंग द ऑडिट एविडेंसेस. मैंने बोला ज्यादा जजमेंट इन्वॉल्व है, या फिर मैंने बोला हायर दी रॉम, है ना, ज्यादा रॉम है, रिस्क ज्यादा है, या फिर रिस्क असेस्ड एज सिग्निफिकेंट रिस्क विद स्पेशल कंसिडरेशन गिवन टू द रिस्क आइडेंटिफाइड एज सिग्निफिकेंट रिस्क. तो यहाँ पे आप क्या करोगे, यू विल यूज लेस ऑफ द वर्क ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिटर एंड परफॉर्म मोर ऑफ द वर्क डायरेक्टली, ठीक है. मैंने बोला जहाँ पे जजमेंट ज्यादा है प्लानिंग में या फिर इन इवैल्यूएटिंग में, ठीक है, प्लानिंग, परफॉर्मिंग एंड इवैल्यूएशन में, या फिर हायर दी असेस रॉम, ठीक है, at the assertion level with special consideration given to the risk identified as significant, या फिर मैंने बोला जो ऑब्जेक्टिविटी है दैट इज वेरी लेस, ठीक है. the less the internal audit functions organizational status and relevant policies and procedures adequately support the objectivity and the lower the level of competence. मैंने बोला the lower the level of competence the lower the work we plan to use of the internal auditors, ठीक है. and then अब अपन चलते हैं ऑब्जेक्टिव को वापस रिवाइज करते हैं. in which area, determining whether we can use in which areas and to what extent. Then we need to use, when using the work of internal audit function, we need to evaluate whether the work is adequate for the purposes of our audit. If using the work of internal audit function to determine whether the work is adequate for the purposes of audit. So now we are discussing this topic that whether the work is adequate for the purposes of our audit. तो इसके लिए अपन चलते हैं, ये वाला चार्ट बस अपन समझ लेते हैं and we will be all done. External auditor plan to use the work of internal audit function, right? So whether the work is adequate for the purposes of an audit, ठीक है. So when I'm planning to use the work of the internal audit function, then I should discuss planned use of its work with the function so that we can coordinate their respective activity, so that we can coordinate our work, right? And then You have to read the reports of the internal audit function, obtain an understanding of the nature and extent of the audit procedure performed, and what are the relevant findings. Okay. Then you have to read the reports of the internal audit function and get an understanding of what is the nature and extent of the procedures that they have performed, whether it aligns to your overall audit strategy and audit plan, and what are the related findings. Okay. And perform sufficient appropriate procedures on the body of the work of the internal audit function as a whole, that is external, that external auditor plan to use to determine the adequacy for the purpose of audit. ठीक है, तो मैंने बोला अभी चलते वापस, ठीक है, if the external auditor plan to use the work of the internal auditor, तो अगर I am planning to use the work of the internal auditor, so I have to evaluate whether that work is adequate for the purposes of the audit, right? So when I am planning to use the work of the internal audit function, the external auditor shall discuss the planned use of its work with the function as a basis for coordinating their respective activities. I have to read the reports of the internal audit function relating to the work of the function that the external auditor planned to use to obtain understanding of the nature and extent of the audit procedures and the related findings. And I have to perform sufficient audit procedures on the body of the work of the internal audit function as a whole that the external auditor planned to use to determine its adequacy for the purpose of the audit. And then discussion and coordination with the internal audit function. So nature, timing, and extent. So in discussing the planned use of their work with the internal audit function as a basis for coordinating the respective activities, it may be useful to address the what will be the timing of your work? When will you be done with your work? Okay. What is the nature of the work that you are performing? What is the extent of audit coverage? So what is the nature, timing, and extent? Nature, timing, and extent. Then the materiality for the financial statement as a whole. Okay. I will communicate to the internal auditor the materiality and performance materiality for the financial statement as a whole. Okay. So materiality. So in discussing the planned use of their work with the internal audit function as a basis for coordinating the respective activities, it may be useful to address the following: the timing of such work, what is the nature of the work performed, the extent of the audit coverage, materiality of the financial statement as a whole, the performance materiality, proposed methods of item selection and sample sizes. तो आप बताओगे internal auditor को how would you have selected the sample sizes and samples, ठीक है? So in discussing, when I'm discussing, ठीक है? So external auditor, when planned to use the work of the internal audit function, the external auditor shall discuss the planned use of its work with the function as a base for coordinating the respective activities, right? So in discussing the planned use of their work with the internal audit function as a basis for coordinating the respective activities, it may be useful to address the following: what will be the timing of such work? What will be the nature of the work? What is the extent of audit coverage? What is the materiality and the performance materiality? What is the proposed method of item selection? What is the proposed method of item selection, and what would be the sample sizes and documentation of the work performed, and review and reporting procedures? So in discussing the planned use of their work, okay, with the internal audit function as a basis for coordinating the respective activities, it may be useful to address the following: what is the nature of the work performed? What is the timing of the work? What is the extent of the audit coverage? What is the materiality and performance materiality? What is the sample selection method? And what would be the documentation? How would be the documentation of the work performed? And how will the review and reporting requirement happen by the internal auditor? So you have to use, and I have to discuss the planned use of the work with the function as a basis for coordinating their respective activities. That is nature, timing, and extent, materiality, sample selection, documentation, reporting, and review. Then coordination between external and internal auditor function is effective. तो इससे देखिए पता चलेगा कि भाई coordination between the external auditor and internal audit function is effective. तो जब when discussions are happening at appropriate interval. So when discussions are happening at appropriate interval, external auditor internal auditor को बताता है कोई भी significant matter आता है that would impact the internal auditor's area. So the external auditor informs the internal audit function of significant matters that may affect the function. तो जो उसकी area जो वो कर रहा है, अगर उसके related उसे कोई matter मिलता है, तो external auditor informs internal auditor regarding the significant matters. Similarly, vice versa. External auditor is advised and given access to the reports by the internal auditor function and informed of significant matters that could impact the work of the external auditor to consider the implications for the audit engagement. So external auditor is advised of and has access to the relevant reports of the internal auditors and is informed of any significant matters that may come to the attention of the function when such matter may be adequate for the purpose that may affect the work of the external auditor, so that external auditor is able to consider the implications. तो मैंने बोला so you have to discuss the planned use of the work with the internal audit function as a basis for coordinating कोऑर्डिनेशन में आप क्या क्या देख सकते हो, व्हाट इज द नेचर ऑफ द वर्क परफॉर्म, व्हाट इज द टाइमिंग ऑफ द वर्क, what is the extent of the audit coverage, what is the materiality and performance materiality, what is the sample selection, how would the documentation look like, and how will the reporting and review happen. So how can you say that the coordination between external auditor and internal auditor is effective? Is you can look at the whether the discussion has happened at discussion take place at appropriate level throughout the period. External auditor internal auditor को बताता है about significant matter. Similarly, external auditor is advised by the internal auditor about significant matters that may impact the work of the external auditor, so that external auditor is able to consider the implication of such matter for the purpose of determining his opinion. ठीक है, अब चलते हैं, क्या मैं इंटरनल ऑडिटर को यूज कर सकता हूँ फॉर द पर्पस ऑफ डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस? ठीक है, मैंने बोला एग्जिस्टेंस, सो अगर ऑब्जेक्टिविटी पे खतरा है या फिर लेवल ऑफ कॉम्पिटेंस पे खतरा है तो आई कैन नॉट यूज, सो द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर शैल नॉट यूज an internal auditor to provide direct assistance if there are significant threats to objectivity or the internal auditor lacks sufficient competence. ठीक है, मैंने बोला existence and significance of threats to objectivity, level of competence of internal auditor. So external auditor may be prohibited. ये यहाँ पे पढ़ो, if using the internal auditor to provide direct assistance is not prohibited, internal auditors to provide direct assistance, the external auditor shall evaluate the existence and significance of threats to objectivity and what is the level of competence. तो objectivity and competence जो हमने ऊपर 2 पॉइंट पढ़े थे वो दोनों आगे, तीसरा वाला पॉइंट नहीं आया, दैट इज सिस्टमैटिक एंड डिसिप्लिन्ड अप्रोच। वो इसलिए नहीं आया क्योंकि डायरेक्शन, सुपरविजन एंड रिव्यू हियर इज ऑफ द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर। द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर्स इवैल्यूएशन ऑफ द एक्जिस्टेंस एंड सिग्निफिकेंस ऑफ थ्रेट टू इंटरनल ऑडिटर्स ऑब्जेक्टिविटी शैल इंक्लूड। तो बेसिकली जब आप इवैल्यूएट कर रहे हो कि वेदर दी व्हाट आर द थ्रेट्स, व्हाट आर द एक्जिस्टेंस एंड सिग्निफिकेंस ऑफ थ्रेट टू द ऑब्जेक्टिविटी, देन यू शुड इंक्लूड इंक्वायरी। ठीक है, it is mandatory here to inquire of the internal auditor regarding interest and relationship that may create a threat to their objectivity. Very, very important. Inquiry regarding threat to independence and objectivity is mandatory in case of direct assistance. So you will inquire internal auditors regarding what are the threats to their independence and objectivity. ठीक है, मैंने बोला एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर शैल नॉट यूज इंटरनल ऑडिटर्स टू प्रोवाइड डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस। अगर ये चीजें हो जाती है, मैंने बोला द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर शैल नॉट यूज इंटरनल ऑडिटर्स टू प्रोवाइड डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस टू परफॉर्म प्रोसीजर्स दैट इन्वॉल्व मेकिंग सिग्निफिकेंट जजमेंट्स, या तो जजमेंट्स बहुत ज्यादा है, relates to higher assess ROMM where the judgment required in performing the relevant audit procedure is more than limited. मैंने बोला higher ROMM को address कर रहा है, या फिर where the work it relate to the work with which the internal auditors have been involved. तो मतलब मान लो internal auditor ने खुद ही वो मान लो internal audit function ने अपने as a part of its routine activity has evaluated that control, तो उसको effective पाया है। अब मैं क्या बोल रहा हूँ, डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस के रूप में मैं बोल रहा हूँ कि भाई तू खुद ही इस कंट्रोल को वापस से रीचेक कर ले, तो दैट विल रिलेट टू द वर्क विद व्हिच द इंटरनल ऑडिटर्स हैव बीन इन्वॉल्वड एंड व्हिच हैज ऑलरेडी बीन और विल बी रिपोर्टेड टू मैनेजमेंट और टीसीडब्ल्यूजी, या फिर इट रिलेट्स टू डिसीजन द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर मेक्स इन अकॉर्डेंस विद दिस एसे रिगार्डिंग द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन एंड द यूज ऑफ इट्स वर्क और डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस। तो क्या मैं इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन को यूज करूं एज एन ऑडिट एविडेंस और डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस अगर मैं ये डिसीजन ले रहा हूं एंड आई एम थिंकिंग ऑफ आउटसोर्सिंग इट टू द इंटरनल ऑडिट डिपार्टमेंट, दैट इज नॉट करेक्ट। मतलब ये डिसीजन सिर्फ मेरा है कि whether I can use the internal audit function as an audit evidence या फिर as a direct assistance. This is the only decision of mine, right? That is the external auditor, and I should not use the internal auditor to provide direct assistance in the following situation, right? When it involves making significant judgments, when it relates to the higher assess ROMM, and the judgment involved is more than limited, and it relates to the work with which the internal auditors have been involved and which has already been or will be reported to management or TCWG, or relate to the decision the external auditor make in accordance with SA regarding the internal audit function and the use of the work of direct assistance. ठीक है, prior to using the work you should have a written agreement from the authorized representative of the entity as well as the internal auditor that they will keep the confidential matters as instructed by the external auditor and inform the external auditor of any threat to their objectivity. तो मैंने बोला written prior to using the, मैंने बोला चार एरियाज ऐसे हैं जहाँ पे आप इंटरनल ऑडिटर का वर्क यूज नहीं कर सकते। पहला जहाँ पे सिग्निफिकेंट जजमेंट्स है, मैंने बोला दूसरा वहां पे जहाँ पे हायर रॉम है एंड द जजमेंट इन्वॉल्वड इज मोर देन लिमिटेड, तीसरा मैंने बोला जहाँ पे आपको ये उसको खुद को काम को ही उसके मतलब खुद के काम को इवेल्युएट करने का मतलब उसको काम एलोकेट किया है, या फिर जब आपको डिसीजन लेना है वेदर टू यूज डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस और इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन, सो इट रिलेट टू डिसीजन द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर मेक्स इन अकॉर्डेंस विद दिस एसे। अभी आपको अगर यूज करना है prior to using internal auditors to provide direct assistance for the purpose of the audit, the external auditor shall, ठीक है, अगर और बेसिकली आप तब कब यूज नहीं कर सकते when there are significant threats to objectivity and internal auditor lacks sufficient competence। मैंने बोला 6 सिचुएशंस ऐसी है जिसमें आप यू कांट यूज डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस। मैंने बोला एक तो ऑब्जेक्टिविटी नहीं है, दूसरा कॉम्पिटेंस नहीं है, तीसरा मैंने बोला सिग्निफिकेंट जजमेंट इन्वॉल्व है या फिर हायर रॉन्ग से रिलेटेड है, एंड द जजमेंट इन्वॉल्व इज मोर देन लिमिटेड and it relates to work with which the internal auditors have been involved, and it relates to decision the external auditors make in accordance with this essay। अब आपको रिटर्न एग्रीमेंट किससे लेना है? एक तो एंटिटी से लेना है कि भाई वो मेरे और इंटरनल ऑडिटर के बीच में नहीं आएगा, ठीक है, दे विल नॉट इंटरप्ट बिटवीन मी एंड इंटरनल ऑडिटर, और वो इंटरनल ऑडिटर को वो जिस हिसाब से मैं काम बोल रहा हूँ उस हिसाब से करने देगा। सो आई हैव टू obtain written agreement from an authorized representative of the entity that the internal auditor will be allowed to follow the external auditor's instruction, and that the entity will not intervene in the work the internal auditor perform for the external auditor। और मुझे दूसरा इंटरनल ऑडिटर के साथ एग्रीमेंट करना है कि भाई वो कॉन्फिडेंशियलिटी को मेंटेन करेगा, ठीक है, as instructed by the external auditor, and inform the external auditor of any threats to their objectivity। What is the difference between internal financial control and internal control over financial reporting? मैंने बोला internal control over financial reporting means सिर्फ वो controls जो कि financial reporting that is relate to the preparation of the financial statement are known as internal control over financial reporting, but internal financial control includes all the relevant financial control। So IFC is broader than internal control over financial reporting, because internal control over financial reporting includes only those controls which are relevant to the preparation of the financial reporting। So the term IFC refers to the policies and procedures put in place by the company for ensuring reliability of financial reporting, effectiveness and efficiency of operations, compliance with applicable laws and rules and regulation, safeguarding of assets and prevention of and detection of fraud। So मैंने बोला these are the policies and procedures put in place by the company for reliability of financial reporting, effectiveness and efficiency of operation, compliance with laws and regulations, safeguarding of assets, and prevention of detection of fraud। On the other hand, internal control over financial reporting is required, where auditors are required to express an opinion on the effectiveness of an entity's internal control over financial reporting। Such opinion is in addition to and distinct from the opinion expressed by the auditor on the financial statement। मैंने बोला internal control over financial reporting के ऊपर auditor को opinion देना पड़ता है, and this opinion is in addition to and distinct from the opinion expressed by the auditor on the financial statement। Therefore, internal financial control is a wider term, whereas internal control over financial reporting is a narrower term, which is restricted to the entity's internal control over financial reporting। So that was it for SA 610. We have completed this thing, and I think we can reconvene for SA 530 in some time। Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye.